Technical deficiencies, lack of food, and inhumane living conditions are affecting thousands of Russian soldiers, both physiologically and psychologically. These accumulated inadequacies are fueling hatred and rebellion against the Russian leadership and military. This, combined with the defeats suffered at the front against Ukrainian forces, is triggering a major crisis in the Russian army. The soldiers and commanders of the Russian army no longer want to fight in Ukraine. Russian soldiers are fleeing the front, mutinying, or surrendering to the Ukrainian army. In this article, we will discuss the huge crisis in the Russian army, the mutiny of Russian commanders and soldiers, their refusal to fight, and their flight from the front. The history and pathology of Russia's wars over the last 2 centuries suggests that the current war in Ukraine could last much longer, given the resources Moscow can mobilize for a strategy of attrition. An important historical observation is that even when faced with defeat, Russia does not cut its losses, but instead gambles on strategic resurgence by committing to a strategy of attrition to the end. Moreover, there are 2 necessary conditions for Russia to triumph in a conflict of attrition. The first is strong domestic stability and support for the war. The second is Moscow's success in isolating its adversary from international assistance. In the current war with Ukraine, neither of these conditions is being met. The Russian army, far from victory on the Ukrainian front line, faces a number of dangers. Is the hierarchical order of the Russian army about to collapse? So what is this great danger facing the Russian army? Let's analyze it together. Low motivation continues in the Russian army, which has not achieved the desired success against the Ukrainian army. Moreover, it was learned that Russian soldiers have not received their salaries for a long time and faced a major cut last month. The salaries of soldiers in 52 regions of Russia and occupied Crimea were either delayed or not paid at all. In addition, instead of 195,000 rubles, the soldiers received much lower amounts. Russian soldiers are on the verge of mutiny over the non-payment of promised salaries and social benefits. Allegations that many Russian soldiers revolted over monetary issues were shared on social media platforms. The latest example of this situation took place in the Kherson region. Mass desertions were recorded in the 205th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade stationed in the Pridniprovsky direction in the Kherson region. The reasons for the desertions included arbitrary behavior of the commanders, mass beatings, threats of being sent to one-way missions, and being kept on duty 24/7 without rest. The Atesh partisan movement also reported that deserting soldiers were not paid for months. We are not surprised that soldiers who could not tolerate this treatment deserted their positions. Some deserters have appealed to human rights organizations for help through their relatives. However, so far they have received no response. The mutiny of soldiers who did not receive their salaries was not the first mutiny in the Russian army. As we all know, when this war started, the Russian army was highly motivated. Russia was completely confident that it would capture Kiev in a few days, but the Ukrainian army put up a historic resistance and stopped the Russian advance. Russian soldiers never expected such resistance. The Russian army was stunned by the success of the Ukrainian forces. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were wiped out in the face of the Ukrainian forces' determined stance and successful offensive. This caused a great panic in the Russian army. Russian commanders had assured the troops that they would easily win this war. However, after the heavy defeat of the Russian army, Russian soldiers began to rebel against their commanders. Was it only the failure of the war that pushed the Russian soldiers to mutiny? Here, we need to go back to the first sparks of the war. Moscow's army was ill-prepared for the war in Ukraine. Russian leader Vladimir Putin thought he had the strongest army in the world. That's why Vladimir Putin thought it would be quite easy to take over the whole of Ukraine. Confident in the strength of his army, the Russian leader threw his troops to the front line without a long preparation process. The soldiers sent to the front line had many shortcomings. The soldiers in the army had no spare clothes and equipment. There was not enough ammunition for these soldiers in the war zone. But the biggest shortage in the Russian army was the lack of food stocks. At the same time, the budget of the Russian army could not finance a protracted war. Russian soldiers first faced the problem of clothing. As the weather turned colder and the first snow fell on Ukrainian territory, clothing became more important. Despite the cold weather, the soldiers' clothing problem was not solved. As a result, the fuse of the fire of rebellion that would burn within the Russian army was ignited. Russian soldiers first started shooting videos to explain the problem. Most of the videos showed soldiers getting sick because of the cold weather and inadequate clothing. Russian soldiers started a revolt by burning the thin clothes the army gave them. Leaked videos and messages from Russian leader Vladimir Putin's army show Russians sent to fight on the front lines rioting, fighting among themselves, locked in basements, and lost in the chaos of a faltering offensive. The newly mobilized soldiers refuse orders to face death. The videos were widely circulated on social media platforms. The turbulent situation of the Russian army has gone viral on social media. However, the Russian leader chose to ignore this problem of his soldiers. Just because Vladimir Putin ignored the problems did not mean that there was no problem. The anger inside the Russian soldiers was multiplying day by day. The increasing number of videos taken by Russian soldiers signaled that the mutinies would grow. The main reason for the revolts within the Russian army can be considered as insufficient equipment, food, and ammunition. However, lack of training is also an important reason that triggers the revolt of Russian soldiers. A Russian soldier made a shocking confession before his deployment to Ukraine. In his confession, the soldier revealed the deficiencies in the Russian army by saying that there was no fire training, no theoretical training, nothing. But Russian soldiers were subjected to severe punishments as a result of their mutiny. Russian soldiers were restricted from using the toilet. The punishments were not limited to this. They were also deprived of food and water. It was as if the Russian administration was taking away the soldiers' right to life. Despite the harsh punishments, Russian soldiers continue to rebel for their rights. Mutinies, desertions, and surrenders to Ukraine have brought the Russian military's personnel shortage to its peak. Since the beginning of the year, the Kremlin has quadrupled its payments for signing contracts with the Defense Ministry, leading to a shortage of Russian personnel to carry out both offensive and defensive operations. In August, the average one-time payment reached 596,000 rubles, more than 6 months' average pay. Combined with an additional federal payment of 400,000 rubles, a contract soldier now receives nearly 1 million rubles when he enlists. Even with these payments, which are enormous for most Russians, Moscow has recruited far fewer contract soldiers than the defense ministry claims. Despite tight government control over the media, news of staggering losses of men at the front leaked back. British military intelligence says that Russian dead and wounded now top 500,000, sometimes exceeding 1,000 a day. According to research by the History's website, many have decided that the only way to save their lives is to refuse to fight. Reporters found that Russia's regions have reached only 50 to 60% of their recruitment targets for 2023, and the downward trend continues. Vladimir Oblast, east of Moscow, sent fewer contract soldiers to the front in April this year than in February, and had to further reduce its recruitment targets for Ukraine. Some military recruitment offices are now focusing on forcibly recruiting conscripts and forcing those already on the front lines to sign contracts. After Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region, the number of people willing to fight has not increased, despite Kremlin appeals to Russian patriotism. On the contrary, human rights activists said they were overwhelmed by calls from soldiers seeking to flee the new war zone. The organization Get Lost, founded shortly after the full-scale invasion, helps those who do not want to fight. According to activists, more than 34,000 people have already received its help. The group provides legal support to potential conscripts by advising them on their rights, helping them resist the illegal behavior of military registration offices, and, if legal methods fail, helping them hide from military authorities in Russia and abroad. They have also recruited people from the front line and helped them sneak out of the country. Equally important is the psychological support offered to potential deserters. Grigory Sverdlin, the founder of the project, says that the decision to go against the system or go into hiding is a difficult one, and people need to properly consider the mental impact before making such a decision. The alternative is a little better. A submissive mindset and the habit of unconditional obedience to government orders often results in people who don't want to fight ending up on the front lines. Psychologists working with the organization say the paternalistic culture in which most Russians were raised makes it very difficult for them to stand up to state authorities or public opinion. In a country where lawlessness reigns and protective mechanisms such as the police, the press, and the courts do not function properly, people feel dependent on the state or other authorities that can provide protection. Some seek help from Get Lost only after they have been sent to war. That is, after they have experienced their first battle or injury. Grigory Sverdlin openly admits that he offers Ukrainians to surrender if there is no option of desertion from the front. Daria Berg, head of Get Lost's Relief and Evacuation Unit, said that volunteers who initially went to the front for ideological reasons began to seek help after realizing how different propaganda and reality are. Professional soldiers who chose their careers before the occupation and were unwilling to participate in an aggressive war for moral reasons also turned to human rights activists. Many of them deserted after being wounded, realizing that they would be sent back to the front. During the deployment of soldiers to the Kursk region, human rights activists reported receiving dozens of applications from all over Russia. Ivan Chuvilyaev, a spokesman for the organization, said that sending conscripts to the Kursk region in the spring of 2024 is illegal because young people with less than 4 months of service cannot be sent to the so-called anti-terrorist operation. Conscripts are increasingly afraid of conscription, which means that the risk of a new mobilization cannot be ruled out. For those who don't want to go to the front, activists recommend mobilizing as early as possible, looking for a lawyer, defending their rights, and thinking about leaving Russia. Because this can often be the only way to avoid going to war. Russia, it seems, is being pushed to the edge of the abyss. And this is not only due to the behavior of the troops or failures on the front line. Russia is at the crossroads of unprecedented economic and military pressures that are destabilizing the domestic and international balance. From the collapse of the ruble to the bloody war in Ukraine, structural problems have emerged that raise doubts about Russia's ability to pursue its geopolitical and military ambitions. In recent days, the national currency, the ruble, has fallen dramatically, crossing the symbolic threshold of 110 rubles to the dollar. This is a consequence, among other factors, of the economic sanctions imposed by the US-led West and the general political climate in the world. Not since the first weeks of the Ukrainian conflict in 2022, when the ruble collapsed under the pressure of the first waves of sanctions, has it been so low. Back then, a dollar traded at 120 rubles, a critical level for an economy heavily dependent on international trade. As of November 2024, the currency situation highlights Russia's growing economic isolation. The new sanctions announced by Washington targeted leading financial institutions, including Gazprom Bank, important for energy transactions in Russia. Smaller banks used to circumvent restrictions to buy technology, and equipment have also come under the radar. These sanctions, which further restrict Russia's access to global financial markets, are exacerbating the domestic economic crisis, While a weak ruble may make Russian exports more competitive in the short term, it also increases import prices, exacerbating inflation, which is already worrying for the population. Parallel to the economic crisis, the war in Ukraine continues to consume enormous human and financial resources, causing human casualties that are reshaping the country's future. Since February 2022, the Kremlin has been waging what many characterize as a war of attrition, taking the lives of many of its soldiers. Russia is facing a worsening birth rate crisis. Between January and June 2024, only 599,600 children were born in Russia, a drop of 16,000 compared to the previous year. This figure, the lowest since 1999, reflects an accelerated population decline exacerbated by rising deaths. The demographic collapse, fueled by war and socioeconomic conditions, threatens not only Moscow's ability to maintain its army, but also its long-term future. The combination of a weakened ruble, a sanctioned economy, and unsustainable humanitarian costs puts Russia in a precarious position. The longer the war in Ukraine drags on, the more difficult it will be for the Kremlin to balance short-term military imperatives with increasingly harsh economic and social realities. While the benefits offered to the troops may seem attractive, they fail to mask the cracks in a system built on fragile foundations. This raises a critical question. How far can Russia pursue this confrontational strategy at the expense of its own social and economic structure? The collapse of the ruble is a visible symptom of a deeper malaise, and the massive human casualties underscore that the Kremlin's power rests on increasingly untenable sacrifices. Beyond sanctions and bloody wars, Russia faces a profound existential dilemma. The path it chooses will determine not only its role in the international arena, but also its survival as a united and functional power. And what about Ukraine? The war is, of course, inflicting unspeakable pain and scars on the Ukrainian army. Although Ukrainian soldiers have been defending their country with patriotic love from the first days of the war, the protracted war has had a negative impact on them as well. In the media, we mostly see news about what is happening in the Russian army. Lately, however, what is happening in the Ukrainian armed forces has also been on the agenda. According to a new report, the number of Ukrainian soldiers deserting their posts in 2024 has skyrocketed as Kiev struggles with Russia's persistent advances and uncertainty over what will happen to the war effort in the new year. 45,543 soldiers are thought to have deserted. Military analysts claim that the figure is at least 100,000, equivalent to 10% of all personnel currently serving in the Ukrainian armed forces. From January to the end of October this year, more Ukrainian soldiers deserted than in the previous 2 years of full-scale war with Russia. Ukrainian authorities distinguish between voluntary demobilization and desertion. The former account for the majority of the total, at 66%. These are soldiers who do not return to their regiments after taking leave, refusing to rejoin the ranks for a period of time, citing personal obligations, negligence in their units, or alleged inaccuracies in their registration documents. Deserters are those who disappear permanently and without giving any reason. Both cases constitute a criminal offense punishable by 5 to 10 years in prison. According to the report, Kiev prosecutors opened 100,000 cases against soldiers who deserted from the beginning of the year until October. This is almost double the number in 2022 and 2023. The Ukrainian army recorded a shortfall of 4,000 soldiers on the front line in September, largely due to deaths, injuries, and desertions, according to a lawmaker. Most desertions were among new recruits. The head of one brigade's legal service, tasked with processing desertion cases and forwarding them to law enforcement, said he had received a large number of desertion cases. The important thing is that they leave their battle positions during hostilities, and their comrades die as a result. We had many cases where troops, small or large, deserted. They opened their flanks, and the enemy came to these flanks and killed their comrades in arms, because those who stood in positions did not know that there was no one else around. The 72nd Brigade officer, who described how Vuhledar, a hill town that Ukraine defended for 2 years, was lost in a few weeks in October, was one of the last soldiers to retreat. The 72nd Regiment had already been weakened in the weeks before Vuhledar fell. Only one line battalion and 2 rifle battalions were holding the town towards the end, and military leaders had even started to withdraw troops from them to shore up the flanks. Each company of the battalion was supposed to have 120 men, but the ranks of some companies were reduced to just 10 due to deaths, wounds, and desertions. About 20% of the missing soldiers from these companies went AWOL. So all this shows that faith in the Ukrainian army is slowly breaking down. In short, the prolonged war is leaving deep scars on both Ukraine and Russia. Although wars have been going on since the beginning of the world, no one has ever been satisfied with war, nor has there ever been a clear winner, because the lives lost during the war have been lives that cannot be replaced with money. Thank you for watching us.